Hello there, welcome to Friday Night's Drum. I'm Julia Baird. On tonight's show, should there be a Minister for Millennials? We ask why so many young Australians feel the future is bleak and whether they've got good reason to worry. And joining me on our millennial panel, journalist Bridie Jabour, business manager Rebecca Deep, welcome, graduate lawyer Jeffrey Winters, hello, and in Adelaide, apprentice plumber Peter Atkinson. Now, if you're on Twitter, you can join us there using the hashtag The Drum. You can also join us on Facebook, and that's where we're live streaming right now. Now, young people looking at this year's federal budget would have noticed a few things. University fees to rise, random drug testing of welfare recipients, and when it comes to housing affordability, first-home buyers have been offered a super savings scheme not even John Howard thinks goes far enough. Now, Greens leader Richard Di Natale said the budget screwed over young people, calling it another attack on Australians aged in their teens through to mid-30s. You've probably heard about millennials. They're stereotyped as lazy, narcissistic and entitled. But what do the statistics say?
I feel like we're perceived as spending our money on ridiculous things, and I'll admit, I think that's kind of true.
My generation is it's going to be the bright generation because of nowadays technologies will improve human, the way we think.
They're all like this, and there's no communication, no people skills.
I think I'd say that we're probably seen as a bit lazy.
Do you think you're lazy?
Yeah.
I reckon we're just lucky to live in a more developed world.
I think they're lazy, but I think that they have been brought up in a world where they maybe don't have to do as much. Like everything is easy, click and instant photos, instant everything.
In 2015, 1 in 4 university-educated millennials, mostly employed in the private sector, wanted to leave their job within the year. But more than half wanted to be in charge. 1 year later, and Gen Y said issues like terrorism, climate change and their pay packets are making them more inclined to stay in their current job. Now, on the downside, 25 to 34-year-olds in Australia have slightly less wealth than people of the same age just 10 years ago, although they currently save more than any other generation.
Younger people have actually not been progressing in terms of their wealth, and that's in contrast when we look at older groups. We see some sizable increases in their assets, and it's largely a story about housing. We know home ownership rates are falling amongst young people, and that's a time when house prices have been growing rapidly, so by being locked out of the market they've been unable to accumulate wealth in the same way that older generations have.
Millennials have the best report card for formal education. In 2011, 26% had a degree, but now they'll be expected to pay more for it and pay it back sooner under the government's budget plans. Now, over 90% of Australian millennials think in the future they will be less financially secure than their parents. And millennials in Australia fall significantly below the global average for home ownership. The government announced in the budget a super saver scheme to get them into the market, allowing first-time buyers to put up to $15,000 a year into their super and offering super incentives for the older generation to sell up.
In the Liberals' war on young people, their education, their penalty rates, their chance to buy a first home. This budget fails the fairness test and it fails the generational test.
Bridie, what is the generational test and why is it, do you think, that this research is showing that only 4% of Australian millennials think they'll be happier than their parents?
What is the generational test is how much, I think it's pretty simple and pretty straightforward, how much is it benefiting a cohort, and we see budget after budget, year after year, that the cohort who benefits the most from budgets and politics at the moment are boomers. They're the most influential voting cohort. They're more likely to be swing voters. They live in those swing seats. Millennials are written off by parties as already being locked into the left-wing vote or not going to vote for a certain party anyway. But as for the unhappiness question, I think that we're in a state of flux and extreme technological advancement. And I think we've had economic growth of In Australia, we've had economic growth for the past 30 years. The beneficiaries of that have been the boomers. And when millennials look to the future, we see very uncertain times. What industry are we going to work in? They're changing so rapidly. The casualisation of the workforce, how are we going to get a full-time job? And most importantly, how are we going to put a roof over our head? I don't think that previous generations stressed about those things in the way that millennials stress about those things.
Do you think that's a well-founded stress, Jeffrey?
I think Bridie's right on 2 points. I think it's never been easier on one level to be a young person. So I think there's also some apathy from that point. We've not been through a recession in our life, 30 years of continuous growth. But the point we don't talk about often is wage growth in that period. The last 6 years, it's relatively flat. So while we keep talking around growth and an expanding economy and how lucky we are, most young people in their pay packet don't see that growth for themselves. You compound that with increased cost of living and the obvious housing issue. Yeah, I think there's a reasonable basis for people to feel it. I don't think politics frame the issues positively necessarily for young people. And that's the second point I agree with Bridie on. A lot of young people live in seats that aren't necessarily marginal, aren't necessarily held by the major government parties, and for that reason I think have sometimes been left behind when it comes to the pork barrel.
Did this budget pass the generational test?
I think you've seen a government for the first time in probably a decade do something about housing for young people. That has to pass the generational test. I agree with John Howard, it should go further. I hope it will in the future.
How much further?
Well, put it this way, whether you're trying to buy a house in Darlinghurst or Dubbo, $30,000 isn't going to get you anywhere near your deposit. If it's twice that or 3 times, I think we're probably getting more reasonable. Saving has to be part of the way you get to your deposit, because I think that's part of the psychology behind home ownership, and that's an important aspirational component. But at the end of the day, you've got to think about this in the way that the superannuation scheme was structured. It was built at a time when most people were going to retire with home ownership. That's no longer the case. So with that fundamental logic taken out of the equation for when we retire, we've got to figure out how we get it back in. And I think it's a perfectly logical way to do it through the superannuation scheme.
Yeah, take the millennials' future retirement savings and hand them over to boomers for their houses. That's what that kind of policy does. And $30,000, I know you acknowledge that it's not going to be enough when you're saving for a deposit. It's not even going to pay the stamp duty for a lot of places, especially struggling if you're a single person as well.
I agree with that, and I think the next point is to adopt a more nuanced approach to these policies. And the next thing you might want to consider is, for example, means testing the family home in the pension determination. I think one of the things we do get left out on is there is quite vigorous and healthy middle-class welfare, particularly in the pension space, which occupies 42% of government receipts in the last budget, and we haven't seen a policy that complements this, you know, get young people into the property market policy space reflected in that the aged pension space. The other issue is also that's going to play into the rental availability market. Currently, you see retirees sitting on the family home because it isn't means tested and it's a secure asset they can hold. If you do encourage people who are holding significant assets, often family homes, 3 and 4 bedroom homes in the suburbs, moving those properties back into the market, you're going to see a supply increase issue, which will drive down prices as well.
Well, let's bring in Peter from Adelaide. How important is the question of housing affordability to you? And did this budget do anything to assuage any concerns you might have?
Well, the budget, I feel it should we should try and direct it to give assistance to, say, apprentices and that are on such a low wage that they can't afford to move out of home or get money together to actually save for a house.
So how are you saving for a house currently?
Well, I'm trying to, but with the wage that I'm on and a car loan that I have, it's very difficult to get money together to get a deposit. So I'm going to try and do it once I've finished my apprenticeship.
And what kind of measures do you think would be helpful?
I'm not 100% sure. Maybe some sort of scheme to just assist apprentices or uni students or such, just to help them get on their feet.
And do you share, Bridie's was talking about the anxiety and the kind of the bleakness that a lot of millennials feel about the future, given the uncertainty of the workforce. Do you share that anxiety?
Yeah, I do. Like, it's so uncertain, like, where the industry's going. Like, there's not that much work in comparison to what there used to be, so it makes it really daunting as to where the future's headed.
Do you feel the same way, Rebecca?
No, I'm not sure who participates in these surveys.
Really?
I've never done one of these surveys. 4% seems pretty low. Yeah,
You're not worried about kind of the changing nature of work, or whether you're going to be able to afford a house or those kinds of things?
No, I think there's more opportunity now than there ever was in terms of being able to choose a path and take it. There are lots of roadblocks in the way, and I think we've touched on some of those already, but I don't think that it is a bleak future, or more so than our previous generations.
Did you feel that this budget was addressing the needs of young people?
Not particularly.
What would you have liked them to have done?
I still feel that everything is quite fragmented. We seem to, when we're focusing on young people, we'll throw some money over here, or we'll throw some money over here, or there's departments working in silo to try and solve the issue, but nobody's working together. We've been advocating for a while for a minister just focused on young people. If we're saying that this is a crisis, do we need somebody that has a portfolio just looking after this? Because otherwise, yeah, everybody's trying to achieve something but on their own, when they really need to be working in together.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea of how we get political parties to kind of pay more attention, or more concerted attention. But to the question of housing affordability, do you struggle with that?
I bought my own home with my fiance, but definitely wouldn't have been able to do that on my own. So we had to have dual income, and luckily we have fairly decent jobs and we've been in them for a while, so we're able to save. But it couldn't have been done on our own, and probably not in areas that we would have preferred.
Bridie, what do you think of the initiatives regarding university education in this budget, paying back HECS, earlier and paying more?
I find it quite alarming. I think the system we've got set up to pay back for university is quite reasonable. You pay back according to your income. If you don't have a job, you don't have to pay it back. And the interest on it, you're never really going to get a loan with interest rates so good again. But it keeps going up so much. It alarms me that in the early 90s you could get a degree for, $6,000, $11,000, and now the average person is paying something like $21,000. And bringing it down so that you start paying back when you're on $40,000 with rents the way it is, the cost of living and stagnating wages, that's a big hit. And even though I think that the budget was overall quite fair and it's fine to ask people to pay an increased Medicare levy for the NDIS, that is a double whack to millennials. You're on $50,000, the Medicare levy goes up and you have to start paying back more sooner. That's a big chunk of your income that's going in the next few years.
Is this a fair description of it?
No, I disagree.
Jeffrey?
I mean, by and large, we all agree the Australian way that we fund tertiary education is probably one of the best in the world. Certainly the access opportunities are greater than anywhere. You compare the US, for example, and it's just worlds apart. I think a modest increase of 1.82% in the next few years, a payback scheme of 1% higher on the minimum, 10% on the maximum when we're talking the wage cut-offs, isn't unreasonable.
But does it concern you?
But they've moved the pay,
they brought it to
way that you bring it down more. So they've moved every single
everyone moves
bit down,
within that
so it's
scale.
increased more. So it's not just the increase in fees.
But at the end of the day,
that's
where's this money going to? This is what we're not talking about. $18.2 billion into schools education over the next decade. 1% increase on the minimum. Over the next 10 years, I think it's worth it for 18.6%.
What about increased funding for universities?
Well, I think the university sector has been struggling with this issue for a long time.
Right.
I think some universities have been better at A, prosecuting the case for increased funding, and B, allocating the funds internally in a more efficient way, effectively. I think there is a case for increased tertiary sector funding, but I think everyone has agreed right now the schooling system was the more needy of the two, and I think it's an absolutely wise decision to allocate the extra billions there.
But do you find it strange that the party of Menzies, who prided himself almost primarily on what he did for higher education in this country, is no longer investing in the same way?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. We invested for many, many decades in a way that Menzies would have been absolutely thrilled with, but Menzies also wanted us to spend what we didn't have. So you've got to marry these ideas together. And I think we're talking about the generation that's a little bit fearful of the future. You want to look at the deficit and debt that's running on. Yeah, sure. We might own a home under the new scheme, but if we're inheriting a government in 20 years' time that's got huge deficits still, what's the point of having all of these other opportunities if we're still trying to pay down something we can't afford today?
Rebecca, is it as important to have a university degree as it has been in the past, or more so?
I don't think so. I guess it depends where people are wanting to head, but I strongly believe there's no substitute for hard work, and you can succeed with or without a university degree, provided that you're willing to work hard. Obviously, there's some careers that require a university degree. We don't want a surgeon operating on us without the right qualifications, or a pilot flying us somewhere without the right qualifications. But I think vocational education is really left out of the mix when it comes to talking to young people, and alarmingly, they can earn so much in those careers, they can progress so well in those careers, and often it's something that they would much prefer to do, and yet we're downplaying the value of those career pathways.
Do you agree with that, Peter, that we don't put as much emphasis on vocational education? There's just too much discussion always about universities?
I feel that is true. Like, it's always university-based, the discussions, and vocational studies is generally missed. And if that area could be focused on a little bit more, I feel that people could find great careers heading that way.
And what would you like to see done? Because you're working as an apprentice plumber now, but if you were to become a project manager or something, for example, you might then consider university studies. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I'd definitely consider university to get into project management, because that ideally is the career that I want to follow. But if there's tertiary options for that, then I'd more likely go into the tertiary side of it. That way I can do, say, night school while I'm still working.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the attitude that employers have towards millennials, Jeffrey?
I think there is a presumption that we're lazy. I think there's a presumption that we are entitled. The stats show that we're better educated than other generations previously before us, and I'm sure with that level of education comes some reassuredness, which our bosses absolutely sense. I think there's also that sense that we've never lived through a recession. We've never really had to battle. The expression is, you've never seen struggle the way that we did. There's a fair point in that. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't be punished for living in a prosperous time. And I really think we are a hardworking generation. 14 to 36-year-olds do spend a huge amount of their time and energy propping up the economy and the society. And everybody can see that in every statistic.
Do you see those stereotypes playing out in your professional areas?
Definitely not. We see the opposite. All we seem to hear is that young people are lazy and unproductive, but all we see is a bunch of hard workers showing up to our yard every morning.
Do you think employers take on those attitudes, though? Any of those stereotypes? And what does that mean?
Definitely.
Right.
I think some are starting to come around. I think what is missing is kind of understanding that with all this technology, it is rewiring our brains differently. We're thinking differently now, and there needs to be a bit of understanding from both generations to be able to come together. You know, with social media at our fingertips, it makes us team players, but also that recognition. We like it regular. We're used to receiving it regularly through social media. So just tweaking a few things in the way that we operate daily in the workplace can really help millennials to thrive.
Now, when the Treasurer delivered his budget speech on Tuesday night, not once did we hear the words climate change. This is despite the fact young people consistently rate it one of the issues they're most concerned about ahead of last year's federal election. The June 2016 survey by Youth Action and the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth found only asylum seekers and same-sex marriage were bigger priorities for those aged between 12 and 25. But in a separate 7 News Reachtel poll released 2 days before the election, young people ranked climate change behind the economy, health and education when it came to influencing their vote. Peter, would climate change influence your vote?
Yeah, I think it probably would.
Which way?
How do you mean exactly?
As in, because you're concerned that parties aren't addressing it, would you vote for a more environmentally conscious Green Party?
Yeah, I think I would, because the environment's so important. Like, if we continue to kill it, well, where are we to? Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Right, but for you, it is one of your top priorities to address climate change.
Most definitely.
Does it frustrate you to know that it wasn't mentioned in the budget at all?
Of course, like, it's a very important topic and it should be brought up.
Bridie, what do we attribute this to?
What, caring about climate change?
The lack of it.
Well, which is going to be the generation that has to live on the earth in 50 years when the havoc has been wreaked. Right. I think it's because, and also maybe young people are just smarter and believe 98% of the world's scientists don't think that we know more than scientists know. But I think we very much trust the science. I think we've done a lot of reading. Also, I think that this has been an issue that I remember it being discussed when I was a kid, right? It probably wasn't discussed when the older generations were kids, so we're very familiar with this issue as well. And I definitely think the fact that we probably are going to be around to see a lot of this destruction plays into our politics around it as well, and our concerns.
Yeah, but it must also heighten a sense of frustration that this is not being tackled with any degree of urgency then, Jeffrey.
Yes and no. I think it is disappointing it wasn't mentioned. I think it's an issue of our generation and everyone owns responsibility, and it's somewhat bizarre that there wasn't some piece in the budget around it. That said, and as you mentioned in your intro, Julia, it's remarkable, and I've spent hours and hours on polling booths in my life. People do talk about big social issues 3 weeks out. When they walk in, you still hear taxes, home ownership and the economy at the top. So you can't really blame governments for reacting on the issues that most people, even the younger people, do consistently list as important to them when they go to the ballot box.
Right, and you should mention that you ran as a Liberal candidate.
I thought we weren't going to mention that, actually. But no, it is true. You know, the seat of Sydney where I ran has a very socially minded, ecologically caring community. It was an issue raised consistently, but there is a sense that you've got to be in a position where you can afford, and I might necessarily agree with this, but there's a sense that people go to the ballot box wanting to ensure that they can afford the life they have today. And that's the short-term political motivation to their vote, and they're not necessarily engaging with what Bridie's mentioned, which is the ultimate fact. It's an environment we're going to have to live in 50 years' time. I don't think it was, it should have been mentioned, it wasn't, and hopefully it is next year.
All right, well, finally tonight, we do want to talk about sex and the fact a US study published last year showed millennials were having less sex than any generation in the last 60 years. Now, that might seem surprising given the popularity of online dating, proliferation of porn and easy access to birth control. But the report went on to say that while there was a bigger group of abstainers, overall, 85% of young people had been sexually active in the previous 12 months. Closer to home, and Tinder announced in 2015 that 1 in 6 Australians were now using the dating app. This makes us the biggest users per capita in the world. Bridie, how do you think that technology and digital embrace is impacting relationships of millennials?
I think it's different ways of doing the same things that we've been doing for centuries, which is meeting people to find someone that you've got something in common with, you might be attracted to, that you can then see in real life, and then, you know, see if things go further. People we don't necessarily meet in bars anymore and things like that. People were always going out looking for people to meet, to have relationships with, to have sex with, and this is just a different way of doing it.
It's not a neutral change, is it? Because this is still a vetting process. It's still a swiping mechanism. There's so much availability.
I think it's easy to get laid, yes.
I think it's still Rebecca's line from earlier. Who are they profiling in these surveys? I mean, I find that stat ridiculous.
Right.
I don't think it changes or makes a relationship less sturdy. I think, in fact, you've got to break away dating from the relationship component. I think we do still have high standards for relationships. In fact, I think because of how easily we can access options, we probably have increased what we expect. It's certainly easy to swipe left.
Right.
I think in the dating phase, we've become perhaps more flippant. I think we do approach it on a more casual basis because it is just there. But as Bridie said also, it's just another vetting mechanism. It's Jane Austen's love letter in the 21st century. That's what it is. It's corresponding. It's just very instantaneous.
Someone should write that Jane Austen on Tinder. But you think it's had a negative impact perhaps on dating, but not so much on relationships?
I don't think it's negative in terms of dating. There's nothing. It's added efficiency to dating. It's added efficiency
We're officially
to
flippant.
Seriously.
Right. Okay. What do you think, Rebecca?
I tend to agree. I don't think that it's just changed the way that we do communicate. It's not less communication or inappropriate communication. It's just different.
And Peter, it's not the only way that we relate and have relationships online. Do you have any concerns about digital relationships at all?
Well, not so much the concerns. Well, yes, there's concerns with digital relationships, but my concern is that social media can drag you away from the actual relationship you're in. When you can be with the person you're with, but you're not with them. You're on your phone doing things, and it can drive a wedge in a relationship. That's one negative side to social media I see. But then also the accessibility of it, it sort of makes it so you don't value your relationships as much because it's so easily accessible.
Have you seen that amongst your friends? Like, people think relationships are more disposable in that sense?
Yeah, in that sense, I'd say so. Like, you can just jump on Tinder, and if it's not going well, you just stop talking to them.
Do you think that's right?
I think that's brutal. I think, but that phenomenon of being on your phone in the relationships, that's got a name, doesn't it? It's called fobbing or fubbing, when you're in a relationship with someone but you lie in bed looking at your phone rather than talking with them. I think there are obviously issues around that, but I don't think that's just a millennial issue. Like, how many older people do you see out at dinner playing on their phones? I think that's across all generations.
You don't think that, but what about all those studies which talk about the amount of time you spend in the digital world and the impact on social capital and the impact on mental health and all those kinds of things? Aren't there a whole new series of challenges that we haven't had to deal with before?
Yeah, it's all those new challenges. But, you know, to bring it back to the dating question more directly, I think by the time you get on a date off Tinder, you've seriously engaged with someone on a level. You probably know more about them than you would if you had otherwise met them in a bar. And the other point I always make when justifying that way of meeting people to, say, my mother, is I probably don't have a drink in my hand while I'm sitting there on my Tinder talking to somebody. I'm probably very rationally analysing what I'm getting before I make the decision to go out and have a drink with them.
As long as someone hasn't been hired to be writing that for you, because there's people who have whole careers about doing the Tinder flirting before.
Julia?
No, I've never even looked at your profile.
You vet it through friends. You send your replies to like 6 different mates. Does this sound smart? Is this clever?
But what about the other thing with millennials, which is gender fluidity, a whole different understanding of sexuality. A lot of people not describing themselves in binary senses. Do you think that's exploded the way we think about relationships?
I think that it's been around for centuries, but it's become more acceptable, and I think that it's amazing that it's becoming more acceptable and that we're having those conversations. And the millennials aren't so tied down to being a man and thinking that being a man is about being masculine and the narrow box that all that fits in, and being just a woman and being a woman is all these feminine boxes that you have to tick. I think that is one big positive about the millennial generation, how much we've embraced those concepts.
And this is the way the app assists that as well, in that I think there was always a culture, particularly for guys, going out to the pub, picking up chicks. That is gone. You can find the person who is comfortable with you for who you are and the way you are through the options you've got in front of you. You don't need to ham it up in a pub necessarily. I mean, you probably do ham it up on your app anyway, but, you know.
Do you agree with that, Rebecca, that there's more of an openness and acceptance?
I do. I can't comment on the app too much because I've never really looked at it. But I think there is more of the culture's changing. It's shifting, and it's probably a good thing.
Peter, what do you think about about sexuality in this generation being far more embracing of all kinds of difference?
I think it's a good shift, and it's allowing people to act in the way that they want and portray themselves how they wish to be seen, and I think that's a really good movement.
You know, we started out talking about all the bleakness of this generation. Now I'm just feeling like you're exuding a lot of positivity, on all of this. But thanks so much to our panel on this Friday night. That is it for The Drum tonight. Bridie Jabour, Rebecca Deep, Jeffrey Winters and Peter Atkinson. John Barron is back with you on Monday. I will see you later in the week. I hope you have an excellent weekend.